What's up, everyone? You're listening to Hey Man, the advice podcast for men. I'm Avi Klein.
I'm Sam Graham-Felsen.
I'm a therapist. Sam's a novelist. Each week, we're joined by a special guest to answer your questions and hopefully get a few of our own questions answered as well. This week, we're joined by Professor Matt Gutmann from Brown University. He is an anthropologist and the author of the recently published Are Men Animals? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short. The book is about how our cultural expectations of manhood and masculinity are not always as grounded in biology the way we think, boys will just be boys or whatever. So we talk about that, his background, studying men and masculinity, and we get an advice question from someone who recently went on a bad date after a dispute about splitting the check. Stay tuned. The book that you wrote is really, this is your thing. This is your area of expertise. Yeah. Right. How would you just describe that? It was sort of new for me outside of really Michael Kimmel, who's the only academic. And I'm not super familiar with the field, but how would you describe your areas of interest?
I mean, broadly speaking, it's the academic study of men and masculinities. There's journals, there are books, articles. There's a center that Michael formed at Stony Brook.
Yeah.
I would say that, for me getting into this, there were two things that happened. One, somebody reasonably asked me when I was starting off in grad school, why is it just women who study gender?
Yeah.
I thought that was a decent question. And then the other is I took a photograph of a guy in Mexico City working in a musical instruments store holding a baby. And I showed the photo to a bunch of friends in the U.S. and also in Mexico, and I got such dramatically different responses. I mean, some thought it was bizarre, some thought it was impossible. I ended up putting it on a cover of a book at one point, and the art editor of the press said, we can't put a posed picture on the cover. And I said, well, it's not posed. That's kind of the point. And he said, no, that's impossible. This guy's Mexican? No, Mexican men are machos. They don't hold babies. And I go, well, that's kind of the point of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed in the acknowledgments that you thanked two of your brothers, and I also grew up with two brothers. I don't know if you had any other siblings, but I'm just curious, if you could give us a little bit of a sense of what your boyhood was like, and would you have described it as a quote unquote typical boyhood? Did you play sports? Did you do typical macho boyish things? I'm just curious, as somebody who ended up interrogating gender and masculinity as an academic, what was your childhood like?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about my childhood, but I just want to mention that for me, I think more than anything else, the study of men and masculinity is a political question. Mm-hmm. It doesn't so much, I'm sure that, my background, which I'll explain in a second, influences, but I think a lot of it is that I've been interested in questions of inequality, social inequalities for a long time. I was a community organizer for 15 years. And so when I went back to school, I was looking for a topic that was understudied but important, that dealt with that I could approach, I thought, that I could bring something to. Anyway, unlike everybody else, I did not have a normal childhood. I know everybody else's was normal. But my folks divorced when I was 3, and my father stayed in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my mother and I moved east to the Boston area. But I would go back to Cincinnati every summer. And I had 2 older brothers. My father remarried a woman whose husband had died and had 2 kids. And so my father had 2 stepchildren. But they became my brothers from the time I was 3. And the transition from the age of 3 back and forth between Boston and Cincinnati, first of all, they're completely different worlds culturally. We were Jewish in Cincinnati, and we didn't know what religion was in Boston, among other things. But beyond that, my brothers made, in particular, one of my brothers at that time, made my life wonderful. He fit me into all his social circles, and made the transition back and forth, which can be, a little challenging for a kid. He made it so much better than it would have been otherwise.
Wow.
And I have a deep appreciation and gratitude toward him for that. And in one way or another, both of them have played huge roles in my life as models in various kinds of ways. We have different personalities, different life experiences, but I look to each of them in different ways as people that I would like to emulate.
So I'm not the psychologist, obvious. I'm just a novelist, but I am tempted to do a little armchair psychologizing that maybe just the fact that you grew up with older male siblings who were actually like role models of generosity and decency rather than jerks who beat you up every day. I don't know, maybe that in some way.
There's a little of that.
Yeah. But there's certainly a lot of idealism in the book about how we're not trapped by certain trends in biology, which of course you point out the 10 million counterexamples of those trends, and that so much of this stuff really is in our control to transcend. So, but again, before we get to the book, we wanted to ask a couple other questions.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
I mean, was something else I was just sort of curious about. Is like we're living in a moment. I don't know. Maybe it's optimistic to say like finally, but where it really seems like masculinity is being interrogated, and where. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, for you, having made your whole career out of this, what it's like to watch this and see it happening.
Well, wonderful in the sense that I think people are questioning what it means to be a man and what men do and don't do or should and shouldn't do. There are social movements like Me Too, which I think have been absolutely profoundly important. And I'm struck in two ways that academic sort of research and talk about this stuff is important, but it's not sufficient. That I think social movements, in particular in relationship to men, feminism, I don't think any changes would have come about had it not been for political and social struggles along the way. And so I think that that's been re-emphasized now. And I think it's fair to say that in men and masculinity studies, overwhelmingly scholarship is rooted in the desire for political change. And so I wouldn't say it's gratifying in the sense of we think we, did something important that laid the basis, but I think we've been addressing problems that are of broader interest now and are taken a little more seriously. At the same time, the fact is, Michael Kimmel once told me there'd never been a job. And as far as I know, there still hasn't been a job in any university for somebody who focuses on men and masculinity studies. That job description's never been written. So that it's still within the academy, a fairly marginalized topic.
Yeah.
In certain ways.
You teach at Brown, which is up there as probably one of the wokest universities in the world, and often on the forefront of things like safe spaces and sort of radical gender politics. And I'm just curious, like, is there resistance or receptivity or both to the idea that like masculinity is, for example, like one of the things you write about in your book that I thought was striking is that maybe we shouldn't laugh all the time when we see somebody get hit in the balls, on a movie or TV. And so much of the book is about the ways in which these kind of folk biology myths that get encrusted about men are completely accepted by even, progressive people in every other respect who deplore racism, who deplore misogyny, but they're still susceptible to parroting these kind of generalizations based on, supposedly based on biology about men. I'm just curious, like, is there receptivity to the kinds of things that you talk about in this book at a place like Brown, or does it still seem almost like if like too much of like letting men off the hook? You know what I mean?
I don't want to sort of plead there's a little bit of everything, but there's a little bit of everything. I mean, the fact is, just take the whole movement around pronouns.
Yeah.
It's very common now among the undergraduates for them to specify at the beginning of a class, when you go around and introduce yourself, what pronoun they prefer. Less common among graduate students. Very common in certain departments for faculty to do it, in theater, in anthropology, in ethnic studies. Some of the ones that are sort of more attuned to political trends today and have politics as more central. If you go into some of the other departments and some of the older faculty, you're going to find confusion at best on why anybody's, making a big deal about pronouns these days. So it seems to me that Brown is a microcosm, more than most people might assume, of a broad spectrum of ideas. I think there's no doubt that it trends left on many kinds of questions. But when it comes to gender and when it comes to men and masculinity, I think some of this stuff is pretty deep-rooted in terms of the language we use and even the frameworks we just sort of everyday life we go around with. Sexual assault at Brown is a serious problem. Maybe it's centered particularly among some of the athletes, but it's not just the athletes. This is a problem that is confronted by the undergraduates on a virtually daily basis in one way or another. And so Brown is not immune from any of these kinds of factors. But I think the good news is that the pronoun thing came out of nowhere, as far as I can tell. And within a few short years, all of a sudden, people were questioning, what does it mean to use he, she? What does it mean to use they instead? And wherever it's going to go, I don't know. But people are looking more critically at some things we took for granted, and I think that's a step forward.
Are men even close to women in terms of the numbers of who volunteers their pronoun?
Especially straight men.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think a lot. I do know there's some controversy, but I don't know how widespread, that a lot of cisgender guys are calling themselves queer. And some queer students are getting pissed off about it, that they're appropriating this term because they're trying to make a statement, et cetera, et cetera. So there's debate over who can be what and what do these different terms mean. But to me, that's incredibly the possibility of it really going somewhere and really questioning the gender binary, which, as you may know, the Vatican has ruled very recently, come out with a major document last summer saying the gender binary is almighty and it's biological, and we have to get back to it and get rid of all this other, flexible ways of talking in gender theory.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just one of the things, and again, I don't want to press you to make generalizations about your students or you're not doing quantitative sociology. But I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is, like, it almost seems like the things that you're talking about in your book are almost like a third rail, because it's you have to say that a statement like, oh, women are, weak, is a sexist statement. Like, that's
right.
Just, you have to say that. But to say men are violent would be widely considered an accurate statement, even by people who consider themselves not sexist, right? And
right.
And I think, like, that idea is still, like, I think that's still pretty hard for people to grok to, because, like, it almost sounds like it's an apology for patriarchy when in fact it's the opposite.
Right. I mean, I think let's get into it. I mean, is my attitude. How many people walk around saying at least at Brown. Oh, well, you know why she was like that? She was hormonal.
Right.
I don't hear anybody say that. I'm not saying that people don't think it, but people don't talk like that nearly as much. They may in certain circles, but not nearly as much overall in the United States, for instance. I think that some of the stuff has been challenged, nowhere near enough, but some of it's been challenged in terms of the language we use around women and what's natural and what's normal and all that kind of stuff, and to what extent their biology dictates how they behave or how they think or how they feel. I don't think we've done a similar kind of critical analysis, but also discussion. I don't think we've had a similar discussion. So just to take, the example that is often bandied about, 9 out of 10 murderers in the United States and many other countries are men.
Mm-hmm.
That's important.
Yeah.
But the fraction of men who are murderers is infinitesimal. It's tiny. So that say that men are aggressive, well, yes, if you hear about aggression, mass murder in the United States, virtually always it's a male. But is that biological? Why aren't all men murderers if it's biological, if it's normal that way? And so it seems to me that you can point to societies in which you have high gun ownership and you don't have mass murders,
right,
by men or women.
Yeah.
So it's not just simply men do this, guns do this, alcohol does this. It's cultural, And so when I heard people talk about Brett Kavanaugh behave the way he did because teenage boys have a lot of testosterone running through their system and they don't know how to control it, I'm thinking, actually, most teenage boys don't assault teenage girls.
Right.
They don't. And they have just as much damn testosterone. So why do we fall so easily into talking about something, hormonal or genetic in terms of Y chromosome? Why is that such an easy explanation for so many things? And why don't we question it more seriously?
Why is that such a tempting argument for so many of us to make? Like, why is it so appealing to dismiss, to write off men as just inherently violent and not challenge it?
Right. I don't have a pat answer. Why do people look to general explanations, not digging too deeply, to explain the world around them? Obviously, people who have a deep faith in religion and God can use that as it's God's will. Mm-hmm. And that explains the world for a lot of people, and it has for a long time. To me, it's not entirely different to sort of say it's biology's will. Mm-hmm. It's because of biology. It's a relatively simple, straightforward way to explain the world around you. And especially when you have so much confusion and debate and Sturm und Drang around gender, a simple explanation that seems to hold water, I think, is appealing for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking as I was reading your book that part of what's insidious about all of this is that if you buy into the biological arguments that men are inherently violent, and you aren't actually a violent guy. Like, I have never been in a fight in my whole life. I've wrestled, but I've never been in a fist fight where I've been punched in my face. And it's funny, on some level, I actually feel guilty, as though like I'm a traitor to my biology. Like, what's wrong with me?
Less of a man, yeah.
Why haven't I been fighting? Like, I must be a freak, when in fact, like, probably like a great deal of men have never been in fights. They just don't talk about it because it's considered somehow like this shameful, betrayal of your biology.
Right. And then to me, the issue is also, is there a class question there? In other words, are boys from the working class in many contexts more likely to fight physically, whereas Wall Street investors, they may not fight physically, but according to, there's one neuroscientist at Oxford who claims that the Wall Street traders are the epitome of masculinity, and they, by definition, must have more testosterone running through their system because they're more aggressive.
Right.
So there's the physical, but then there's psychological aggression. There's, all the rest of it. To me, the question fundamentally is, are we moving in various ways to a degendering world? So, for instance, take alcohol use. Historically, men would drink more in many societies, and men would drink stronger kinds of things. That is less true today than it was before. So gender is less associated with one kind of alcohol consumption and the amount of consumption. I mean, the amount you drink. Men can still drink more if they're larger, et cetera, but the physical differences between men's and women's bodies is not so horribly dramatic. And so what you're finding on college campuses is girls and boys are drinking a lot, and they're drinking the same stuff. And so it's less associated. Now, are we going to move in the same direction with regard to political leadership? 100 years ago, no women were in parliaments and senates and all the rest. The only women leaders were basically queens of a few countries. Now, we're nowhere near 50-50 now, but it's much harder to argue that women cannot be, because of their biology, because of their emotional makeup, political leaders. Whereas 100 years ago, people were convinced. If it wasn't biology, if it wasn't natural, then how could you explain that over millennia, women had never risen to be leaders? Something's changed dramatically in the last 100 years. And it seems to me that it's a general degendering is the direction that we can possibly go in many other realms as well.
Can I ask you to explain the difference in your mind between biology and folk biology? Because you're not saying that that biology is completely irrelevant in this book.
Not at all. So to me, the distinction between biology and folk biology, you could say, is what, as a system of thought, is what scientists practice. Folk biology is what is popularly picked up. And they're not necessarily different. They can actually, that you have plenty of scientists, including Wrangham, which argue fairly strongly for the innate biological, natural compulsions that males feel to do various things, such as have sex with as many females as they can, as often as they can. And that this is something that has developed through evolution, and female choosiness is contrasted specifically with male aggressive attempts to procreate as much as possible. It seems to me that, first of all, take an example like pornography. I had a job interview many years ago with one of the leading cognitive anthropologists in the world. And we were talking about my research on men and masculinity. And he said, look at Matt, he said, clearly culture is important, but in many ways, biology is going to determine what men think, do, and feel, and how it's very different than women. He said, take the example of pornography. And now this was 1996. The internet was not yet blasting pornography all over the place in people's, homes. And so if you were going to watch pornography, you had to get it out of a video store or go to a porn theater or something like that. And it was overwhelmingly what men did. And his argument was, and he had studies to back it up, men are visually stimulated in terms of sex. Women are looking for something else in terms of sex. To get sexually excited, it's a relationship question. It's not a visual stimulation. Therefore, porn's going to be popular with the guys, not with the women. Lo and behold, 20 years later, 30 years later, we see that women are watching porn in numbers never seen before. We have to ask why. Have women's biologies changed and all of a sudden visual stimulation is important to them? Or has something else changed? And what's changed is the shame of watching pornography, or the embarrassment, or the, all that is not going to be present if you can do it privately, if nobody really knows what you're watching and how. And so lo and behold, not all women, obviously, not all guys, but more women than ever before watching porn. But an argument that was made emphatically, uniformly, 20 or 30 years ago about male and female sexual behavior has now been disproved in a way that never could have been predicted. The internet.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that we need to question more some of the basic premises, such as choosiness among males and females. The evolutionary psychologists will tell us females are choosy, males are not. That's garbage, in my opinion. Any human experience, guys will not have sex with anybody they can have sex with. It's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that some guys don't want to have sex with a lot of different women, et cetera, but I know plenty of women who want to have sex with a lot of different guys too.
Someone should get the data from Tinder or something and run a study now that people can choose so much.
Yeah, but we know from our experience in the world today that it's qualitatively different than in our parents' and grandparents' generations with regard to that. So something has changed, and it ain't been the biology. What's changed are cultural standards that allow women or force women, whatever you want to say about it, but the practices are changing, and that points to culture being tremendously important. And the final point I would make about all the chimpanzees and bonobos and whatnot. First of all, there is variation between the chimps and the bonobos, and everybody knows about it. The bonobos have sex a lot. The chimpanzees fight more. Okay, the chimps are used as examples for human evolution because supposedly they're our closest cousins. The people who study the bonobos come along and say, actually, the bonobos are just as close and they have sex all the time. So why are you just focusing on the males who are violent as opposed to the males who want to have sex all the time? Mm-hmm. Or who do have sex much more often. But more importantly, if you take any population of chimpanzees and any population of bonobos, the range of behavior in any group will exist. There is, not all chimps act the same, but the range of behavior is extremely limited compared to the range of human behavior, not just today, but historically. And so there is a qualitative difference in male human behavior and female human behavior, and we really get into trouble when we overdo the comparisons to non-human animals.
The subtitle of your book is How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short, and I'm hearing all of the flaws in making these broad assumptions about what it means to be a man and how our biology dictates that. But how do men? I mean, what's the alternative for men? How do they get shortchanged in the system?
To the extent that we think men are pre-programmed to act certain ways, in terms of sexual assault, in terms of not being emotional, whatever it is that you happen to think, whatever stereotype you buy into, I think that we don't expect men to be any different. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with some people saying rape, for instance, males raping females is natural. It's not good, but it's natural. Well, if that's what you think, then what you have to do is you have to separate men off from women, because you can't stop them from wanting to do what is natural to them, supposedly. And I think that is selling them short. I think that that's not holding them accountable for their actions. Mm-hmm. So if you say Brett Kavanaugh had a lot of testosterone,
it's just who he was. Yeah.
It's just, he couldn't help himself.
Right.
And I think it does a disservice to young men, ultimately, to say that their testosterone just takes over their bodies at a certain point, and the poor guys, they can't help it. Don't hold it against them.
Yeah. In a way, it seems like it's obviously daunting to try to transcend fixed biology, but I also think it's quite daunting if we accept the premise of your book, which I do, that this is largely cultural and political. These behaviors that we see that are disproportionately male behaviors, such as murder. But it seems to me that it's still daunting to transcend something that is so culturally embedded. So that's still a scary task. It seems like an enormous
to set yourself apart, thing. You mean?
To be different. So, I know that you're an academic. You're not here to do self-help, but and there aren't really prescriptions at the end of the book. But since we are a podcast that gives advice, before we actually move on to our advice question, I wonder, what just on a practical level, I mean, we want men to do better, but it's not that easy. What are some steps to take?
So, first of all, I think part of the pitfall of exaggerating the influence of some uniform biology is that if you think that way, you really can't act any other way. And I'm an anthropologist, and one of the pleasures of anthropology is we study people all over the world in all sorts of different contexts. And we study all different historical periods. And lo and behold, there's incredible variation in what it means to be a man. So you went to Harvard, I teach at Brown. We can talk about Ivy League students or something, the male students. Well, that's a very limited microcosm, okay? But if you all of a sudden learn about men being men in completely different, or what might seem completely foreign in different ways, all of a sudden that opens up the possibility for thinking that I can be something else. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that questioning the language we use, actually learning, digging down. If somebody says men are by nature aggressive or more aggressive than women, well, okay, let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. What do you mean? In what context? Why are there such differential rates of rape, for instance, in the world? It's not the same everywhere. Mm. Okay? And it seems to me that there is tremendous value in not skimming over the surface lightly.
Yeah, and actually one of the, we haven't given any stats, but just two that really stuck out to me. One was the difference between the rate of rape in Alaska versus New Jersey, which is something like 8 times higher there. And as you say in the book, we would have to suppose that there's some kind of biological difference between Alaskans and New Jerseyans to, credit that to biology. And the other striking one, and maybe you could just spend 1 second explaining this, because I think this will be pretty surprising for most people to hear. We've talked about this statistic often on our show that in America, the suicide rate among men is triple what it is among women. But actually in China, men commit suicide less frequently than women do.
That's actually it's changed in the last 10 years.
Okay. But it was at some point. And
right. This is my next book. No, seriously.
Oh, yeah.
I'm doing I just started a study. I was in China about a month ago, trying to figure out why the rate has been much lower for men than women. And then why in the last 10 years it's all of a sudden shifted. Yeah. Worldwide, 3 or 4 times more men commit suicide than women. However, more women try to commit suicide.
Right.
So there's a lot of questions. One of the best articles I've seen on the topic about the United States talks about the very high incidence of suicide. Now, very high. Most men don't try to commit suicide, don't commit suicide. Okay, so we're talking about of those who do, and it is a serious public health issue. In the United States, white, middle-class, older men is one of the highest demographics. And so you ask why? It's not racism that they've suffered. It's not poverty that they've suffered. What is it about this? And one of the arguments is this is a group of men who've had more control over their lives for virtually their entire life. They have been able to dominate others to an extent that they haven't suffered racism, et cetera. They've been in more managerial positions, perhaps, and whatnot. And later on in life, their life has lost a purpose for many of them. Yet they don't control, they don't have the power that they used to. This is one of the, to me, fascinating arguments about the question of suicide. But there's no doubt in some countries, young male suicide is the number 2 cause of death after vehicular crashes for young men. And yet it's not being looked at as systematically. It's being looked at still as an individual problem. 30,000 articles have been written in the last 20 years about suicide. Only a few hundred have been written in the social sciences. Virtually all of them are in psychiatry journals and psychology journals, and it's regarded as individual problems of mental health, for instance, which is obviously a factor. But there's some social factors that we need to look at more systematically. And I think the fact that it's guys, we're not used to looking at men as a risk factor in terms of health. And I think we need to do that more.
Great. Thanks.
So we're going to switch to the advice question. And yeah,
we're trying to this is a political choice on our part. We're trying to destigmatize men asking for help.
Yeah.
That's part of what we're doing here.
But if you ask my daughters, they'd say, don't listen to whatever he says.
All right. Hey, man, I'm 19 years old and have just started dating a girl that I go to college with. We've been dating and hanging out for the last 6 weeks. On our first date, I asked if she was cool with splitting everything, and she seemed fine with it. On this last date, though, I accidentally forgot my wallet in my dorm room. It wasn't until it was time to pay for our food that I realized I didn't have my wallet with me. I told her I would pay her back later when I got it, and I was surprised that she was really annoyed by this. She said something like, if anything, you should be offering to pay for me, not the other way around. I kept trying to explain that it wasn't intentional, and I felt embarrassed and I wasn't asking her to pay for me. It didn't do anything to get her out of her bad mood, and the date was pretty much ruined. We were supposed to go to the movies afterwards, and she basically said she wasn't going to buy my ticket. Instead, we went back to my dorm room, and I paid her back on the spot. It's only been a couple of days since, but things have obviously chilled between us. What should I do? Signed, Cash Poor in Colombia. We thought this one might be a good one for you, although we'll do our best not to analyze the gender dynamics here, although it's a piece of it, I guess.
Absolutely. So to me, one of the great things about gender and studying gender is everybody, it's not like, if I were a professor of Baroque architecture, my students would know nothing.
Yeah.
Everything I would be telling them would be the first time they'd heard it.
Mm-hmm.
And the first way they'd thought, first time they'd thought about something. If about gender,
mm-hmm.
everybody's got experience and everybody's got an opinion about it.
Yeah.
And so to me,
so what do you hear in this? Yeah.
Just going out on a limb here. I'm fascinated by the fact that people can talk about change in terms of equality, and women should earn as much as men, and men should do more childcare than their fathers did, et cetera, et cetera. And I think those are deep beliefs and deep desires for people to practice. At the same time, I think a lot of us, probably most of us, continue to play with gender stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Think about hair. There's a lot of guys with long hair and a lot of women with shorter hair. But overall, more women have longer hair and more guys have shorter hair still at this point.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that's continuing to play with a certain kind of appearance.
Yeah.
Very few of my male students wear makeup.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my female students do wear makeup. There's no good reason one way or another why it should be like that, but it's a way to play with gender and to play with appearances and play with relationships, it seems to me. And it sounds like for this young woman, that is still something serious, that a guy does certain things or should.
Mm-hmm. And
for the young man, he's more of a mind of, wait a minute, why should things be old-fashioned like that?
Yeah.
And a little bit coming up against it. My guess, and just a guess, is maybe she didn't know quite what to do with it, and she thought maybe he was taking advantage of her in some way. But maybe she's stuck in some old ways of looking at things, particularly with students. They're trying to figure this shit out.
Yeah.
They're the next day she could have gone out on a date with another guy and she paid the whole thing happily because they're trying to figure this out. They're taking absolutist positions one day and they're changing their mind dramatically the next.
I appreciate that empathy for identity in flux, and yeah, it's just you have to give yourself permission to not take it too seriously because it's an experiment,
right? And it's always good to keep that in mind. But I think recently Avi and I were having a conversation off of the podcast about how sometimes, so Avi works a lot with men, and he got a lot of attention after he wrote an article for the New York Times about men sort of struggling to deal with their masculinity in the wake of Me Too. And I think one of the tricky things is sometimes when you work with men to be more emotional, more vulnerable, they come back to you and tell you that
their wives don't want to hear it.
Yeah, that their wives are like, "What's wrong with you, you weakling?" You know, and it just seems like one of the tricky things about this stuff is that men who are making a good faith effort to get away from some of this quote unquote toxic masculinity sometimes are facing consequences from women who are still a little bit stuck in playing those traditional. I mean, hearing you talk about it, it almost sounds like cosplay. That idea of dressing up, and it's almost like there's gender cosplay going on sometimes.
Yeah,
I think in a weird way, I think guys sometimes have an easier time.
Yeah,
breaking out of some of this stuff than the women do. I do in one of my classes, we have a gender inappropriate dress day. So whatever you think is inappropriate for whoever you are, you're supposed to dress differently. The guys have a much easier time. I mean, they come in tutus, they come in, with makeup, all this kind of stuff. The women have a much harder time because there's virtually no clothing that women don't already wear.
Yeah.
So the only way they can do it generally is they paint on beards and mustaches. And that's kind of shocking looking and all that. But I think it's harder. People talk about stoicism and sort of the Marlboro Man cowboy mentality as being an ideal that women wish men would, assume. And that's the opposite of, displaying one's emotions and all that. There's no reason women should be any more immune to these kinds of social pressures than men. So I think that women, with regard to themselves, in some ways, it's been easier. But with regard to men, I think that's a little bit more uncharted territory.
I guess I'm just thinking. So, my reading of this question is, when he asked, "Do you mind if we split?" I guess she said she didn't mind, but maybe really she did. And once this, he forgot his money, that was like the last straw for her or something like that is kind of how I made sense of this. And I'm just thinking about what this guy should do at this point, like how to talk about this with her.
By the way, I just want to say one thing that I think is funny about the paying of the bill situation, which is that I actually totally get why some women still want men to pay the bill. It's like one of the few times in the patriarchy where women just get something nice for free. They just get it's like in every, they lose out on leadership positions. They're not allowed to talk in meetings. And it's but they get a free dinner. I don't really blame them for being a little resistant to give that one up. But I think that, I think it's, I don't know. I think actually, getting to what Matt was talking about earlier, that might be a useful strategy for him to just not assume that this is her, concretized, unmovable position on paying. It was just like a mood she might have been in at that moment. And, you know, just without, I think without turning it into some giant discussion of, do you think men should pay for dinner or this or that? You know, putting her on the spot as somehow being backwards in terms of the chivalry stuff would probably be a bad way to approach
I agree.
it.
Or maybe she thought he was a creep and that he did it intentionally, you know, and she was like, hey, what the hell? You know, it's not that hard to remember to bring your wallet. You know, that's a really weird thing to do.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, as in so much else, why, if he's writing you guys, why can't he address it more directly with her?
Yeah. That would be the first step. I agree.
You know, he may be, I mean, if he's writing you guys, he's very aware of, you know, or he's trying to become aware of all sorts of, you know, what do guys do, what guys shouldn't do, and all that. And he's thinking, in every place I've ever looked at and ever lived and ever spent time in, you got a lot of contradictory stuff happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Take China today. You have more women PhDs than ever before in history. At the same time, the government has come out and said women who are not married by the time they're 27 will now be known as leftover women.
Ouch.
They don't say anything about the guys.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have tremendous kinds of forces working at cross purposes going on in China. That's just an example from there. But here you can also see it. You know, my guess is if we sat down and talked to the two of them, they would both agree on many things in terms of what women should do that would be identical to men. And then they might have this dinner thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the exception to the rule.
Totally.
Kind of, you know, let's maintain that one. Who knows?
It does kind of
trying to work it out over time.
It makes me, I mean, that is one of the things I'm sort of curious to see just as time goes on. Like, there are things that we, at least if you're on the left politically, like there are things we want to see in the world and change that we want to see. And then there are the things kind of unconsciously that we want, you know, like, and I work with so many couples and it's like, and with a lot of women too. And they want a sort of, there are certain places like in the bedroom, for example, where something that is more stereotypically like polarized around gender lines, like is appealing to them. And they just want that. And I think that's really interesting. It's like we can't really police our desires, and yet they're coming from our culture in a way that harms all of us at the same time. So it's hard to know where to take a stand on that.
Yeah, I mean, to say something's cultural versus biological doesn't mean it's not deep and, you know, has a lot of holding power. Yeah, cultures don't change overnight either.
Yeah, is there a way like to be like I think this is maybe where you were going. Like, let's say she just wants to feel taken care of, right? And wants him to pay. And like, is there a way to be playful about that without like maintaining the patriarchy?
So to me, there's a question of scale here. The patriarchy does not just reside in interpersonal relationships in a family, for instance. It's there. Yeah. But it seems to me it's much more complex in a family. I mean, if you look at families all over the United States or all over the world, the actual relationship of who has decision-making power around what issues is incredibly diverse. Yeah. Whereas if you look at parliaments and state legislatures, Fortune 500, university presidents, all that kind of thing, it's much more male-dominated, much more clearly male-dominated. And there is certainly a business masculinity, international business masculinity, as theorist Raywin Connell has described very well. So that when we're talking about patriarchy, it seems to me we're talking institutions and not just sort of personal Joe Schmo and his attitudes. Yeah. It's related, but I don't think the family is simply just a microcosm or just a mirror of institutional problems. I think the problems are much greater in certain ways at an institutional level. I think there's much more sharing in many more families than you find in governments.
I would imagine you're right.
Yeah, you know, so it is an issue of scale. It's like, you know, as long as these these people who are, I'm just projecting, are nice, lefty college students who are, on the right side of history with regard to gender politics. Like, so what if, in on restaurant dates, she's into him paying. I do think that I think that he could probably open up a playful conversation with her about it. I think,
that's right.
And I think like one thing that my wife is good at doing that I'm terrible at doing is when she has a bad interaction with somebody, she will very quickly, like the next day at the latest, say, hey, can we talk about, that thing that happened? I felt kind of weird about what had happened. I just want to hear from you what was going on with you. But what she does that I think is skillful is that she always starts from the posture that like she wants to know what she might have done to provoke a kind of weird or awkward response in the other person, rather than pinning it on them and being like, well, you were acting weird. So I think, maybe that's just like a way in of just saying, hey, I felt like there was kind of a strange dynamic there. I wonder what I might have, what I might be able to do differently, what I might have done to make you feel weird in that situation.
That is good advice.
My wife likes me much better on this show than in real life.
Well, you credit her a lot. So.
That's right. Because I'm not right. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, we usually ask people if there's some advice that someone has given them or that even they found in a book, something that stayed with them that still carries weight. And I'm wondering if anything comes to mind for you.
I mean, so much. I'm trying to figure out one thing in particular.
Yeah.
Or rather, they're not like pithy, general kinds of comments that I'm thinking. It's much more particular about me and my personality.
Okay. I'm down to hear it. You're sitting with a therapist.
But it actually fits directly with what you just said your wife does, in part, which is if she's had a problem with somebody and a disagreement, her starting point is, well, maybe what did I do wrong? And not jump. In other words, in terms of trying to resolve it and trying to either replay it or make amends. The best advice for me personally I've gotten is that I don't take responsibility always for the full sort of what's happened. And coming back to masculinity, maybe it does. We'll see if you can weave it in.
Yeah.
That it's, in a certain sense, when you end up blaming yourself a great deal for things that happen wrong around you, it's in a perverse way a form of control.
Yeah.
That you think you're more all-powerful and able to change things than you may be.
Yeah.
So it requires a certain amount of stepping back, but it's also a relief from some of the guilt that you can feel when things don't happen.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, that's some of the best advice I've gotten, but it's awfully personal.
Yeah. Yeah, but I bet there are.
Sure it applies more generally.
I mean, that's certainly applicable to me, I would imagine, for Sam too.
Sure, yeah.
So don't think it's as personal as you might first guess. Yeah.
Can you tell people again the title of your book, where they can find it, and if you happen to be on social media or any other platforms, where they can find you there?
Great. The name of the book is "Are Men Animals? ? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men short. It was published by Basic Books 2 days ago. And it is available on Amazon and all the other normal places people buy stuff. If there are bookstores still in existence, I trust you can find the book there as well. And I'm on Facebook, though not super active. I have a Twitter account, not super active either.
So people want to find you, they need to take a class with you? Is that?
They can just find me at the Brown. My last name is Gutmann, Gutmann, at brown.edu. Awesome. And I answer all my emails.
Oh,
all right.
wonderful.
Be careful what you wish for. All right.
Thanks so much.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much,
guys.
Matt. Take care. that's a wrap, everybody. As always, you can email us with your advice questions at heymanpod@gmail.com. Better yet, shoot us a voicemail, 917-426-4326. If you want to get your Instagram or Twitter on, we're at heymanpod. And as always, we really appreciate if you would give us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. It makes a big difference for us.